Everybody.
Good morning.
How's everybody doing? Tired at all? A little bit? Yeah. Hope you enjoyed the open session. Yeah, thanks for coming today. I really appreciate it. This particular topic, I think, of all the topics, in some ways, is the most important in a lot of ways. Our guests today have spent their careers working with students in the SEL space, among others. I'll introduce him, and I would say that, so Dave Melnick, I'll start with, who works for an organization, the two of my own kids spent a lot of time at, and it really helped them through some really difficult times. So I respect and appreciate all the work that they do at NFI in Burlington. Carrie Zales, who is, she's assistant superintendent of Plattsburgh City Schools. Her name has come up already multiple times here for the work she's done. Chris Mazzell has mentioned a lot of her work over the years. So we're in good company in this topic. I just experience it in schools, and because you all work it every day and they spent their lives on it. And Carol Tong-Mack from the University of Cincinnati has, I'll let each of them kind of introduce themselves and talk a little about their work, but has done some retention work that is about on the college level. So I think it's a good continuum to talk about. Dave has a presentation that will kind of, I think, get some conversation going, but how it kind of into the college space as well. Carol will have a lot to say about that. So why don't we start with Dave and then go to Carol and Carrie, and just give a little bit, a brief introduction about, how you got to where you're at, and, what you're working on now.
So John, just do an introduction, round circle, and then go into the presentations.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear from each of the three of you, just to give people a sense of your, what you've done. And then Dave, that'd be great if you could. I think it'd be a good for you to kick off the presentation, to generate some talk and ideas.
Okay. So I'm going to be very brief. I'm Dave Melnick. I'm a clinical social worker here in Vermont. I've been doing social work for close to 40 years. I'm rounding 38th year. So it's high enough in the 30s that I can say close to 4 decades of working with children and families. I have largely worked over the course of my career in a variety of different settings that serve children and family: residential, outpatient, day treatment, partial hospitalization. I am a social worker by trade. So what you're going to hear from me today is some intensity about systems and organizational work. And I'm really excited to share a little time with Carol and Carrie.
Do I go next?
Great, thanks, Carol.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carol Tong-Mack, and I'm an assistant dean at the University of Cincinnati. Most of the times people don't know what that is, so I just tell people that I help students graduate, whatever it takes to get students across the finish line. So it's not just about recruiting our students, but it's also making sure that they get that piece of paper out of the door. I work at the largest college on campus, which is the College of Arts and Sciences. And my role is pretty much, when students hear from me, unfortunately, it's never really great news, because my job and my role entails student academic misconduct, grade grievances, anything that it takes to make sure that we're educating our students and they're learning and they're teaching us as well before they walk out the door. And so that's I'm here to share a bit about what we can do in education, and I'm really hoping to learn a lot from the other panelists as well.
Hi, I'm Carrie Zales, and I'm the assistant superintendent here in Plattsburgh. Excuse me. And really, this is my 27th year in education. I went through the ranks as a teacher, as a building principal, and then moved into a district administrative position. Sometimes wonder why I did that, but clearly what that has allowed me to do is actually build a system within our school district for multi-tiered intervention. Probably what looks a little different about our district than most of our region, and I can only speak about the region that I live in, is that we actually practice a system of multi-tiered intervention in social emotional work as well as our academic interests. So we've spent about the last 6 years building that system, the last 3 building the social emotional leg. And moving forward, I feel like during this time period that we're going through of uncertainty, it is more necessary than it has ever been. It's actually, I think, part of the formula of survival for all of us at this point in time.
Thanks, Carol. Thank you, I appreciate that. Dave, you have it on your end. Put it up on the screen. That'd be great.
Sorry, John, having a tough time hearing you. Am I on now to, good to go?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, give me a second. I'm a visual learner and a visual teacher, so I'm gonna share my slides and make, jump right in. One of the advantages of sitting amongst the panel is being able to hear the ideas and response and listen to the people that I'm sharing the panel with. The slight different disadvantages, it doesn't afford time to join and build rapport, which I like to do to just get a sense of usness. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about my work. I am almost exclusively these days a person that focuses on trauma and transforming trauma. Most of my career has been focused on working with children and families that have been exposed to trauma. So I'm going to talk about my focus on trauma and healing and on stress and resilience. And I believe that we cannot determine whether most emotions and most thoughts and most actions, either from students or from staff, are desirable or undesirable without understanding systems and contexts. So I believe it's largely organizational and workforce skills that determine outcomes of our students, and not simply trying to build essential skills for individual students. I don't believe that that's the most efficient way to go about the work of building social emotional skills. An emotionally literate workforce, in my mind, is the most important critical thing that we can do in our schools to build the infrastructure for then teaching and working with students to advance their particular skills. I think sometimes it's ironic that the people metering out social emotional curriculum often go unexamined. So I want to speak a little bit about that as well. I think that social emotional skills are human skills. And John and I talked about this a little bit last week, I get really tired of them being talked about as soft or secondary skills. They are not augmentative skills. They are necessary skills for successful human life, regardless of what you choose to do in your life. Yet, which skills we prioritize and whose values are being reflected in our social emotional learning curriculums is critically important, because I wonder sometimes, do we really understand that every student we work with has immense assets that are often unseen and even criticized? And so I'll just reference the work that I've been part of, that I've been privileged to be part of in the last 38 years, is without exception, every child, every family member, whether they're a student, family, or client in my clinical practice that I've ever worked with in 38 years, and that includes now people in the thousands. So of those people that I've worked with in the last 38 years, I have worked with social emotional skills in those people, every one of them, that are relevant to the context and environment of their lives. And so I don't believe that I get to label these as good or bad without great respect for the circumstances in which these behaviors develop. And so one of the things I'm really aware of and increasingly aware of is that I am a white, straight, cisgendered, upper middle class, well-educated man, and that most curriculum, including both academic and social emotional curriculum, are reflective of white upper middle class values. And so one of the things that I think is critical in our curriculum building is that we have to consider culture, we have to consider values and ideology as central to our schools. That without considering culture, values, and ideology, we are not being equitable in our practices, in our construction of curriculum, and how we work with our students and with our workforce. I believe that in order for schools not to be trauma and stress inducing, we have to consider, again, power and privilege. And I'll make a statement that often rubs against the viewpoint that many people in schools have, and that is that behavioral outcomes amongst our students does not rest singularly on the shoulders of our kids. They are impacted on how we interpret, how we understand, and how we address the very behaviors that we see. we as a workforce, as adults, are inextricably connected to student behavior and social emotional learning. And so I'll give an example, and then I'll go into the 5 key ingredients of how we work at developing social emotional and trauma-informed, trauma-transformed abilities in the schools. And so one example that I'll give you is one of the things that often gets misinterpreted and misunderstood in schools is the behavior of defiance. Defiance comes up a lot. No, I won't do that. You can't make me. I'm not going to do it. And so my understanding of defiance, for instance, is that it is a very intelligent relational move for a kid to be chronically defiant. Yet it is often not viewed as a standard SEL skill when I believe that it can be an incredibly important SEL skill. Because when I look at defiance and I turn the lens just slightly from students that I and you and we work with, when I look at defiance and I just turn my lens slightly, I also see tenacity, and I see outrage, and I see determination, and I see protest, and I see self-preservation. What we see is in the eyes of the seer. We have a choice to see things the way we want to see things. So my belief is that when it comes to students, when it comes to social emotional skills, trauma-informed skills, that we surveil and curtail students' behavior too much at the expense of understanding the emotional world of our educational leaders and of our workforce. I think that we need to be surveilled as much as our students. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. In our work, in the work that I do in Vermont and some in the North Country of Vermont, it is essential. Our organizational workforce skills are as important as the skills that we apply and we teach to kids. And so our approach is, let's fix systems and workforce. Let's not fix broken children. And let's look at the brilliance that emerges in their behavior instead of just looking at their brokenness. So our model, our trauma transformation model that is embedded in kind of social emotional concept is a do as I do model, not as I do as I say model. I am not interested in conformity and compliance. I'm interested in equity and resilience. That is automatically messy work. And so it's not about blame. It's not about it or the students at fault or the workforce at fault. It really is about working to improve human systems, whether those are being delivered in schools and mental health agencies like the one I work for. And so here are the critical kind of skills that and I'm just going to do a soft touch on them just to give some exposure to folks. So there are 5 key ingredients of our trauma transformation in the work that we're doing in schools. These 5 ingredients, I want you to keep in mind that they are methods, strategies, interventions, but they start very differently than most curriculum do and most approaches do. Is we conceptualize our work as first having an impact on organizations and on workforce. We believe in the trickle-down model that if you teach and you prioritize the people that are working with students, that the very same skills that are necessary for us to do our jobs properly with kids with SEL challenges and with trauma-related challenges, that when we have a workforce that has the proper intervention, mindset, understanding, then those are going to trickle down in intentional ways amongst the students that we work with. And there are 5 key ingredients of the medicine that we're trying to use in schools to kind of heal what ails us in schools and mental health agencies and child welfare. So 5, very quickly, I'm going to say a couple things about each one of these and then stop. So the first key practice that we focus on tirelessly with the workforce that we work with is we talk about stress, and we talk about post-traumatic stress, and we talk about that one of the primary ingredients to shift is our understanding of stress. And there are 3 themes that we focus on when it comes to stress, and or plot lines when it comes to stress, and our belief that every human being that works with other human beings needs to understand about stress. Number 1, we want to debunk the myth that stress is inherently good or bad. It is neither. Stress is the value of good stress or not good stress. The value of that is related to the duration of stress, the amount of stress, the type of stress, the age you are, at the age that you are when you're being exposed to those certain kinds of stress, and protective factors. Because on one hand, I can say very clearly to you that stress is necessary for a meaningful life. And on the other hand, I can say stress can either be an animating force and a productive human experience, or in the category of post-traumatic stress, it can be debilitating and harmful. What I know about school and working in schools is that one of the most debilitating versions of stress is that many in our workforce, for organizational reasons, are asked to suppress negative emotion. Many of our teachers, educational leaders, in New York, our TAs and aides, that part of the expectation of working in some of the systems and organizations that we work in is we are expected to suppress as professionals negative stress states. By negative stress states, I mean things like anger, fear, rage, despondency, despair, worry, overwhelm, that we are taught to swallow and hold that in. And the reality of that, we know the impact of that. The impact of suppressing too much negative emotions and negative stress states amongst our workforce is that when you suppress it, it intensifies in your body. And when it intensifies in your body, it metastasizes. And when it metastasizes, it causes terrible harm to your body and to the bodies around you. Second theme about stress that we focus a lot on in our work is that when stress becomes problematic for you, then stress becomes problematic for me. We are interconnected as a species. When your stress is causing problems for you, it is causing problems for students. You can't teach them, or you are significantly impacted in the efficacy of your training, whether you're training in SEL or academics, if you are not detecting and moderating your own stress. So the second thing is when it's problematic for you, it's problematic for me. Before we started, Carol and I were talking about sports a little bit. I'm an athlete, have been an athlete all my life. I am both an individual sport athlete and a team sport athlete. When it comes to stress mitigation, resilience, well-being, those are all team sports. You have individual responsibility, but ultimately we progress or regress as a species, as a school, depending on the character and the quality of how well we are working together to detect, connect, and ultimately mitigate stress. So that's stress as a key. And I talk for hours and hours and do hours and hours of work with the educators that I work with in New York and in Vermont. Second key practice is reflective practice. And if you're not familiar with the term reflective practice, if you're trained in mental health, you're familiar with it because it's what we talk about in terms of clinical supervision. But here's what I mean by reflective practice. For students, we know that you cannot learn unless you reflect on your experiences, your academic experiences. Reflection, whether you're learning a sport, an instrument, or an academic task, you simply can't learn it efficiently and effectively if you don't reflect on your experience of learning. In the context of trauma transformation and as an SEL skill, we need to have a workforce that is practicing reflective thinking together. So the very quick definition of reflective practice and why it shows up as one of our core practices in trauma transformation is that reflective practice is the ability for us as a workforce, individually and collectively, to look inward, to self-examine, and to self-interrogate. The goal of reflective practice is secondarily to understand your students better. The primary goal of reflective practice is to understand you better. We don't have enough time in our IEP meetings, our 504 meetings, our child safety team meetings. Kids are too complicated to understand every one of them. The quickest path to being trauma informed and to enrich social emotional skills in us as adults, the fastest path to that is not professional development. It's reflecting together on our blind spots, on our pedagogy, and our implicit beliefs and biases. The central goal of reflective practice is we sit in groups of 2 to 6 people and we use our relationships with one another to understand ourselves better, because none of us can see the back of our head. We all have blind spots. The only way that you see the back of your head is with a mirror or somebody telling you about the back of your head. The same thing about our practices with kids and with one another. We need a more three-dimensional view of ourselves, because one of the things that I believe is most ironic in our work is that sometimes, more than sometimes, we ask 4-year-olds and 7-year-olds and 9-year-olds and 15-year-olds more, we ask them more, and we demand of them more rigorous examination, interrogation of their own behavior than we demand and require of ourselves. And it's minimally ironic, and it's at most harmful to kids that we ask them more rigorous questions about their behavior than we often ask ourselves about our behavior and our conduct and our feelings and our body states. So reflective practice is about prioritizing ourselves and increasing and maximizing the ways that we understand ourselves. Third key practice is what we refer to, and many of you know the term reframing, and I'm going to very briefly talk about it and then wrap up in a minute or just a couple minutes. And so here's what reframing is, and here's why it's so critical to trauma transformation and as a central social emotional skill for our workforce initially, and then perhaps for our students. Here's what reframing is. We as a species are neurobiologically wired to label things that we see, to classify, to frame them, to put them in frameworks, categories, classifications. That's the way our brains work. We can have some input on that, but when you see something that you haven't seen before, you're going to put it in a label. You're going to label and categorize it. We all frame things. That's, again, the way we're neurobiologically designed. However, we have a cortex, and the cortex allows us to reframe, relabel, and recategorize. That we have a choice to determine and decide what it is that we are seeing. When you work with a student that is chronically defiant or avoidant or back talking, you have a choice on what you label and how you understand that. Reframing, what it does is it challenges the epidemic in our schools and in our mental health agencies and in our media and elsewhere to use singular, unidimensional descriptions for very complex behavior that we see amongst ourselves and particularly amongst the kids that we work with. This is simply marginalizing. When we have a very simple, unidimensional, singular label. And so what reframing asks us to do is to embrace that for every complicated behavior that we deal with, there are multiple truths about that. There are multiple ways we can label it. There's multiple ways we can understand it. Reframing asks that we live in the world of both and that we ask a fundamental question of ourselves. And that is, when a child is acting up, we ask ourselves, what else could this be? Stop lingering on the immediate thing that comes to mind, because the immediate thing that comes to mind is kind of tired old descriptions of kids. That kid's defiant, that kid's lazy, that kid's avoidant, that kid doesn't care, that kid has ODD. And so reframing is a way to counter message and to think differently about the presentation of behavior from a very different multiple lens, multiple label possibility. The fourth, and I'll just say very quickly again, when I see a student that is ongoingly defiant and I get called in to consult, I am already leaning in the direction of this kid's defiance is also tenacity, it's also self-protection, it's also boundary setting, it's also anxiety, it's also exercising power. Of all the things that I reframed, all of those are pro-social skills in the right context. The second thing that really plagues schools is behavior that we call avoidance. And I'll give you a very quick reframe on avoidance, and then I'll move along to the last two key practices. Avoidance, when students put their head down on the desk, when they put their headphones on, hoodies on, it is a way of creating distance from people and places that represent harm to them. It is a means of seeking sanctuary. So again, I'm not condoning these behaviors necessarily. I'm trying to understand them from multiple lenses. When we understand them from multiple lenses, we actually increase and broaden the things that we can do to try to address some of those most problematic behaviors. Avoidance is a way of trying to create distance and creating sanctuary. It is when kids decide to pull out and not expose themselves any further to pain that's being associated with what they're being asked to do. In avoidance further, many of us that are in the equity work know that silence is often the language of harmed and marginalized people. You can't take silence away from people. Number 4, very quickly, I'm not going to talk much about this because I want to say something about the 5th one. 4th key practice is upstreaming. If we have time in the discussion, I'll go back to that. And the final one that I absolutely love is what's called, you may or may not be familiar with, everybody's familiar with the term self-care. What co-care is, or community care, it's very different. What the concept of community care is about is that in order for schools to be healing places and to transform trauma, we have to understand that resilience, well-being is relational. It is a team sport. Self-care is not the gold standard of well-being and wellness amongst human beings. It is necessary, but is not sufficient for a well human being. In order for human beings to be well, we've got to take care of one another. That's the way we've survived for hundreds of thousands of years. And so one of the things that I'm really worried about with the self-care buzz in the last couple of decades is that there's a not so subtle way that if you're not well at work, it's your fault. And it takes the response away from the organizations as being a healing organization. So our very ability to be well and survive as a species depends on our ability to rely on, depend on, and provide for other people. And that's a critical part of what we talk about as a key social emotional skill in the schools that we work with. I will stop there and turn to, was it Carol that was up next?
Yeah, whoever'd like to jump in, for sure. I know Carrie has some systems work she's doing that's out, like everything that you just laid out. But Carol, for sure, whoever to jump in.
Yes, I don't have a presentation like Dave, though.
Yeah. That's all right.
I don't either, Carol.
Yeah.
I'm just going to simply answer as a panelist.
Yeah, I mean, but is it okay to make a comment or no before we go into the panel?
Absolutely.
Okay. The only thing I was going to say, I was really trying very hard to hold on to my seat when Dave spoke, because, you know, I'm not sure if most people know, in Black churches, in the Black community, we say hallelujah, praise God. I mean, we are praising everything. And I really wanted to jump out of my seat and say amen and hallelujah many times. Because so often with not just, you know, younger children or middle school children, but also I'm talking about college age children. I really wish we had a class about social and emotional learning in the first year of college, incorporated into the curriculum throughout the 4 or 5 years, and then have something very specific for students before they leave college. And of course, we need it as well in the workplace, because we need something. I really love that last part you said, Dave, about community care. For some reason, I don't know, we have lost that somewhere. And maybe we never had it, I don't know. Maybe we just need to be in certain neighborhoods to have that. But at some place we lost it, and I hope with this presentation and other educators that are listening, that we get the opportunity to get a small slice of that back. And I'll just go ahead and, you know, wait for the other panelists and questions that I can jump in. But I was hallelujah and amen. I was writing things down, and I was so excited to hear everything that you had to say, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, I'd love to come back to you. I have a number of questions out kind of as students get into college. But Carol, you and I talked a little bit briefly about exactly what you're doing there in Plattsburgh and your systems approach and the way that it's evolved, and you've been doing this a long time and how it's changed, especially during the last 18 months. You've continued to sort of move it forward. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there on the ground?
Sure. So one of the things that was problematic, I've been in this district for 17 years, 10 of them as a building principal. So I moved into district administration with some understanding of our culture and our climate and kind of the way the district was doing business. And what I saw was that we had no system. So our students were really suffering because depending on who they received as a teacher determined what they got. And so I often use this analogy. We could have started two 5-year-olds in kindergarten, and we could have watched them as they went through their kindergarten year all the way to their senior year, and we actually would have had two very different outcomes purely based on our district. Forget about homes and all of those other pieces, but purely based on our district, we could have had two very different outcomes, both academically for those students and socially, emotionally for those students, because our teachers and our staff were not working in a system. They were working in closets. And so students got what they received from who they were assigned. And as everybody knows, in some cases that can be outstanding. And in other cases that can be devastating. So when we started with this look at multi-tiered intervention, it was evident that in order for us to call ourselves a school system, we needed to start acting like that. And so there was a lot of work that needed to be done. And 6 years into this building of a system, I continue to work with leadership teams to really get a total understanding of what this means and how this produces efficiency and effectiveness in the work that we do with students. Anything other than a system is really avoiding what our final outcome should be, which is, ensuring that FAIR is getting what you need, not everybody getting the same.
Go ahead.
And so I would just say that for the social emotional component of this, our district does a universal screener in grades K through 11. And that screener is used to really kind of just start a sorting mechanism of students who we need to watch and find or get further multiple measures of information for both internalizing and externalizing behaviors. Obviously, our biggest concern is our internalizers, because our externalizers are kind of in your face. You can see them, they're not hard to point out. They're the ones that are throwing F-bombs or throwing chairs or whatever the case may be. Internalizers are tough. They're some of our best performing students. There's some of our students who are our AP kids who are compulsive about perfection. And, I think sometimes that gets lost, that concept gets lost in how well they may do academically, but how they may be suffering, socially, emotionally. And so we sort these students, and then we look at multiple measures, and we cross-reference with grades, we cross-reference with attendance, and any level of reteaching forms, because we don't actually focus on consequence giving discipline, we focus on reteaching. I'm not saying there isn't a place for consequence or discipline, there surely is, but the majority of our student behavior can be redirected and retaught. And so when we look at those factors, we then come up with some pretty solid lists that have cross-referenced research validated information that identifies the students really that, when you think about it from a fiscal perspective and a resource perspective, should be priorities for districts. And so my student support personnel people, their caseloads need to be filled with these priorities. And that's kind of how we whittle through our resource allocation. Then these lists are given to teachers. Do we have the right kids? We want to make sure we're servicing the right kids. And then we go through an assignment of intervention based on function of behavior. I appreciate what was said regarding students who put their hoodies up. Students whose function of behavior is one to escape, we need to be really careful about what type of intervention we're assigning to those students. And so we assign intervention, we progress monitor intervention, and we build an action plan for those students at both tier 2 and tier 3. But what I'm finding is our tier 1 is where we need to spend the majority of our time right now, because we started this from a reactionary standpoint, right? We were getting a lot of special education referrals for behavior. Our district happens to utilize our local BOCES very little. We keep most of our programs on campus. So our teachers are aware of what there is to be offered to students that may need some support. And so the automatic response is reactionary. Kid A can't manage it in my room. Kid A needs to be in her room. And so we needed to stop that mentality. And that was part of building the system. And I would say that our tier 1, what became apparent was that as we were reacting to the bleeding that was occurring in tier 2 and tier 3, so we focused on fixing that part of our system, we now have to go back and we have to solidify tier 1. So like all of our students get a social emotional learning grades K through 12. We have classroom management plans that every teacher is required to complete with a classroom matrix of what behaving looks like in their classroom in a variety of settings for a variety of reasons. We have school-wide reinforcement systems. We have classroom-wide reinforcement systems, and that can't just be verbal praise. It can be in addition to verbal praise. We have a district-wide correction procedure. The same correction procedure is used K through 12. And we have surely data review in our universal teams of all of these tier 1, 2, and 3 systems to ensure fidelity and to ensure effectiveness. It's not perfect by any means, but I do think we're on our way to building something that will put us in a better place than we ever have been with students' social emotional needs.
Thanks, Carrie. Anybody have any questions? That's really interesting. Yeah, please.
Carrie, can you tell us what screener you use?
Sure. We looked at a lot of screeners. Bottom line here was we are screening almost 1,800 students. And this is not the only place we screen. We screen for foundational skills in literacy and foundational skills in math. So although the process has become ingrained, it still requires time. And so we use our initial screener is called the Student Risk Screening Scale, SSRS, internalizing and externalizing. It is our initial sort, and that just kind of highlights the students that we need to gather more information on. We also use, when we need more information and we're kind of getting into the nitty gritty, we also use the BERS 2 rating scales for both parents and youth, if the youth is grade 3 or above. So we gather more information that way. We also have, we call it all hands on deck. You can't do this unless all hands are on deck. And so we have people that go in and do classroom observation as well, because we want to make sure that we understand the function of the behavior, and we would like to see what that looks like over a period of time. So sometimes we spend, about 3 or 4 visits in a classroom to kind of see this. And if we can, we do it in a variety of settings, so we're not just seeing it with one individual. Understand that one of the biggest things that comes from this is we have to ask ourselves, is the issue the student? Is the issue the setting? Or is the issue the adult? And so we have a response to all of those things, because I think, as David said earlier in his presentation, it's not just about fixing broken kids. Oftentimes it's broken adults or broken schools that need to be fixed. And so we really need to be conscious of that as we go through this process.
Follow-up question, Carrie, what SEL curriculum are you using in the high school, or actually all the way through?
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Carol had her hand up, so I wonder if we should pause for that, for Carol to speak into what she wanted to say before we move on.
I'll actually wait for the person I will wait for Carrie to answer the question, and then I'll go ahead and ask. Thank you, David.
Sorry, Carol, thank you. The SEL at the elementary that we've used for a number of years is, we use it K through 5 as second step. And then in grades 6 through 12, we're using overcoming obstacles.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question for Dave or anyone else in the audience. As we're talking right now, we're really talking about children who we know, for some, not all, but many of them will go on to college campuses, regardless of where they are. So my question to you, Dave, or others in the room, what are we doing, or what partnership or collaborations do we have with colleges? So for example, Carrie, where you are, again, some students, I'm sure the data will show you what schools, colleges or university students tend to go to, or wherever you are, Dave. You know, what are we doing to collaborate with those institutions that are nearby? Because we know that because you leave, you know, elementary or junior high or high school doesn't mean everything stops, right? So do you know of any institutions that are doing anything when students get to college?
I don't, I mean, I know there are partnerships locally here between public schools, public high schools, and University of Vermont. The University of Vermont Department of Education is doing some interesting trauma transformed work and SEL work. So they're steeped in terms of the training of teachers, and because we're a small state, a fairly robust collaboration with mental health agencies like mine. But I'm not familiar. I'm not involved at all. And once kids arrive so much on campus, you know, what some of the SEL focuses are. Carrie, or people in the audience may have a better sense about that.
Yeah, Carol. Go ahead, sorry.
No, the only thing that we happen to have a SUNY college, a state of New York college, right? Like I could throw a rock and hit it. And it's challenging. You know, I believe that in totality of the collegiate program that we work with, there hasn't been, I don't believe, a ton of impact, but yet the particular college has different schools. So like they have an education program there. And what I see is that dependent upon the outreach to the local school districts for particular programs, there has been a lot of discussion regarding that you can't just stop teaching these things when kids are 17 years old, that, you know, there's still a frontal lobe development that hasn't completed yet. And so we probably need to continue. I know our local college does a freshman orientation and a freshman experience program that freshmen are required to take their entire freshman year. And they do focus on some of these things. I also know in the area that I live in, I sit on a board of directors for the Development Corporation, because businesses that want to do school to work need to also start considering this as well. We have students who are barely making it through high school, going into the workforce, and there's nothing being provided to them in the form of education about long-term life planning or about SEL in the workforce. And that's one of the recommendations I've made to that committee, that if they want kids to join them, students to join them, and they want students to stay, they're going to have to recognize the infancy stage that these children are in when they exit high school.
Carol, I'd love to hear, so to answer your question too, so CFES, over the years, we were, I would say, you know, we were 90% of the kids we were working with were going to college, that was great, and then we weren't really following after. It's like, okay, you got there, we did our job. And then we realized in the past 3 or 4 years, you know, how can we somehow, you know, our staff is limited, so it's difficult. We can't start going to colleges and helping. But like at UVM, University of Vermont, we started sort of matching. So we have New York City students who go to UVM, we have kids from rural areas. Once they get there, kind of lining up with individuals like yourself or people that can help them once they're there. But I'd be curious to hear, Carol, what some of the, you know, you're getting students from all over with a lot of different needs. What are some of the things you're seeing and things that you do to help retain them?
Yes, thank you for that. I think a lot of the things that I do, you know, when students walk into the door in the first year, as Carrie was saying, we have a first year experience, right? So we do a lot of things with first year experience where students are part of a learning community, where they're in about, you know, about 25 students taking about 2 classes that are similar, right? So that's the best way that we can incorporate that, but it has to be intentional. So I don't think that there's an intentional curriculum long-term plan to actually incorporate this. As Carrie was saying, it depends on who you get, meaning like as a teacher. So for example, with those learning communities, they all have peer leaders. So if the folks who are training the peer leaders, if that peer leader happens to come from, let's say, the University of Vermont or a transfer student, they may incorporate something like that. But if you're not aware of, SEL, I don't think you're going to do anything with that specifically. So I'm really, one of the things that I'm going to do after this call, I have a team meeting actually this afternoon. I'm going to mention this as part of something that we should intentionally do with our first year students, again, incorporated throughout the sophomore and junior year, as well as something in the senior year before they leave school. Because as Carrie was saying as well, many of our employers, and again, this is something national, not just at the University of Cincinnati, not just at any one school. Many of our employers are saying that our students don't have the essential skills that they need. Now, it's not just the communication, the listening, the working in teams. You can't do any of those things if you don't have SEL, right? As Dave was talking about, he was talking about the stress model and community care and some of the other things. We can't really do our jobs, right? Because sometimes, as Carrie said, we have broken adults. So I think we also need to have this in the workplaces where, as part of the orientation, when you get a new job, you're in a new place of work. Maybe this needs to be part of the orientation and the training that we get as adults so that we can listen better to our students. Because oftentimes I think when college students, yes, they still get in trouble, right? So even if they're in college, it doesn't mean that trouble no longer happens. That's why we have a student code of conduct that students must follow. Oftentimes, we really want to make sure that we're not punishing students. So we don't use the term punishment, at least here at the University of Cincinnati, at least not in my college. We don't use punishment. We say that we offer sanctions to students. They're educational sanctions, because this is not a place of, criminal law. We're really trying to educate students so that when they leave school, when they leave the university, they are prepared to go to the, to employers. And I really would like to see SEL more incorporated. We do restorative justice for some of these things when students act up or whatever, but I would really love to see that more incorporated into the classroom.
Carol, do you think that colleges and universities notoriously siloed in every way, academically and everything? I mean, does it seem like, to Carrie's point, that she's trying to build this system, everything you just mentioned, do you feel like it's getting a little more systematic on the collegiate level?
Yeah, well, right now, as you know, most universities are sectioned into colleges. You have the College of Education, engineering. I mean, you name the 8 or 9 colleges at least that we have. But we have to get to a point where when a student walks into the door, we need to make sure that we're having like one of those university 1001 classes. I don't know what it's called, or 101 courses, so that all students, no matter where they're coming from, get the same information. So whether you're a first year student coming in or a transfer student, because we can't forget about them either. Because we have students who are transferring, let's say, they went to Ohio State, for example, the Ohio State, and then they didn't have a first year. So now they would like to come to the University of Cincinnati. We want to make sure that, hopefully I don't get in trouble for this. I see Dave looking like, ooh, that's a football analogy right there. Well, we're like number 1 or 2 now, Dave. So, be careful. So we want to make sure that student from the Ohio State, to making sure that as a transfer student, you're still hearing that same information about SEL or whatever it is. So yes, I do believe that colleges are very siloed. However, there's a fix for that, right? We have to be intentional in making sure that all students are receiving the same information throughout the curriculum.
Thanks, Carol. I want to make sure I'm not missing any questions at all so far. Thoughts or anything anybody's doing that has been working too. I'd love to hear about. Yeah, please.
I wanted to ask Dave if you could talk a little bit more about upstreaming.
About upstreaming? Yeah, upstreaming. So I use that in a couple different contexts. It's a social justice word amongst other uses, and it's really about prevention. We talk a lot about responding to symptoms. Upstreaming is about looking at the architecture that is in place that enables and allows problems to exist. And so part of upstreaming is looking at things like white supremacy and racial trauma and social cultural trauma. And what have we done in our design of organizations that precipitate and create difficulties for many of the students and workforce members that are in schools? So upstreaming is about, let's not just focus on symptom and symptom management. Let's also focus on true equity, which is about equal, is about who's around the table, whose voice is heard, how is that voice heard, who has power, who has resources. And so upstreaming is really conceptually about how are we taking a critical look. And I love some of the language that Carrie was using, and Carol, like not looking at consequences, but looking at reteaching is not just a reframe. It's not just a relabeling. Conceptually, that's very different than traditional discipline. Traditional discipline is the kids got to sweat and bleed a little bit to learn their lesson. Reteaching comes from a place of the kid did what they did because they lacked the skills. I would take it a step further as, did the kid do it in response to problems in the system? And so upstreaming allows us and compels us as educational leaders and mental health leaders to take a look at the ways that our organizations are organized and structured, and what's problematic around those kinds of things that have to change on an organizational level.
Can I mention one thing about, I'm sorry.
No, please.
Could I mention one thing about what you were saying, Dave, and to also give a little bit more with that person, with the person who asked the question, with upstreaming. For example, as we're talking about preventative solutions, when a professor contacts me and said, this student cheated or plagiarized or aided and abetted or fabricated information, right? Oftentimes on the form that they fill out, there's an option where the professor can check a box that says they don't want it on the student's official record. It's just reported, it's not on the official record. But sometimes professors, because they're not thinking, I'm not saying all professors are this way, they just want to punish the student because how dare you cheat in my class? Do you know how long it took me to get my doctorate degree, and I did this, and I went through the 10-year process. How dare you cheat in my class? And oftentimes I have to say to them, brother, it ain't about you.
Yeah.
Sis, it's not about you. It's about the student at this point. Yes, they may have been stressed. They may have just intended to do it. Who knows why the student cheated, but it's an opportunity to give educational sanctions. So let's have a conversation with a student about why did you cheat? So oftentimes I said to the professor, okay, why don't you do me a favor? Okay, let me meet with the student, and then I'll let you know if it's, the student was really going off the board. They really intended to do it. And sometimes they did intend it, but it's what's behind the intention. So sometimes we have to look a little bit deeper, a little bit further into why students have certain behaviors, why they do the things that they do. Yes, it's going to take more time, but sometimes we have to imagine if that person was our child, our sibling, our sister, our brother, our niece, our nephew. Sometimes we have to realize that, as Dave was saying about, given the hoodie analogy, because the student, and again, and I want us to be clear, not all Black and brown kids wear hoodies, okay? All sorts of kids are wearing hoodies now. And so when that child puts a hoodie on, they just need refuge. So we need to do the same thing as we're thinking about sanctions for students and not punishments. How can we provide educational sanctions to students without punishing them? So let's meet and talk with the students. So when I talk with the student, you just realize there are all of these other things going on. Yes, I cheated. Yes, I plagiarized. Yes, I fabricated. But I did it really quickly because I was helping my little brother get to his doctor's appointment, and I just couldn't make it. And so I just copied and pasted and sent it without citation. And I think oftentimes we have to get a little bit deeper before we give these punishments to our students. And we have to make sure that we're giving educational sanctions so that when they get into the workplace, they know a little bit more information than they knew before. So thank you for that question about upstreaming and the explanation about preventative care.
Hey, Carol, I think that's a great example. I just want to underline, applaud, and join you that what I heard you say felt like a perfect example of, and you can both hold students accountable and have compassion. They can coexist, right? And the sanction part is about accountability, that we do want to have accountability, provided that there's context, and you provide the potential for context, not an excuse, but context. The understanding that you talked about in the way that you would approach that feels like it is the kind of grit of relational oriented practice, which is what heals systems. Like the systems get healed and people get healed in relationship. Just giving sanctions does not preserve the relationship with that student. So I loved how you just hashed that out in a way that was so clearly about both and approach.
But thank you for that, Dave. Sometimes we forget where we come from. I'm originally from an island in the Caribbean, Antigua. We're known for our 365 beaches. But I grew up in the South Bronx in New York. And we were talking about this, Dave, right? When you grow up in the Bronx as a young Black girl that's an immigrant, people don't always give you the time of day. People don't always show you compassion. So you have to remember what you did not receive. Maybe it's an opportunity for you to offer something to somebody else, because we always want, we all humans. We have to remember the human element, We all want to be treated well. We all want compassion. One of the things that I'm so glad you said that word, Dave. One of the things I learned in my therapist appointment, because don't get it twisted, y'all. We all need therapy. I know I go to my sessions on a regular basis, because when students give you things, you got to give it to somebody else sometimes. And one of the things that I've learned from my therapist is that we have to be compassionate to ourselves first. We can't show compassion to students and do anything with SEL if we don't even know who we are, where we're from, and how to offer our own self-compassion. Carrie, I think you had your hands raised.
Yeah, and I just would add to this that in public school systems, what I believe to also be true, and the reason why our district has chosen to make this part of our multi-tiered system of response is because sometimes we do need to dig and say, is there a skill set that this student actually doesn't have? And if there is a skill set that is inclusive or connected to behavior that a student doesn't have, it is our responsibility as a school district to treat that no differently than if the student had a broken foundational skill in reading or math.
And I'm going to give a quick shout out. I'm going to make it real quick. I'm going to give a quick shout out to Middlebury College, because when I showed up at Middlebury College with my hoodie, my Timberland boots, my short haircut, my gold caps, this was the 90s, I had my little gold caps. They did not judge me. They knew I went to Samuel Gompers High School in the Bronx. It's a vocational technical high school, okay? And here's this lily white school on the hills in Vermont saying, we know you're number 1 or number 2 in your school and you have something to offer. That's SEL right there. Showing some compassion, knowing that you have something else to offer. So it didn't matter what I looked like. Then I ended up getting pregnant my freshman year. They were like, that's okay. That's okay. We got you. That's SEL right there. And thank God for therapy on Middlebury College. So I'm going to give a quick shout out to Middlebury College for seeing the person that I could be then and what I could become later on. Who would have thought a little girl from the South Bronx who was an immigrant would one day become an assistant dean at the largest institution in Southwest Ohio, at the largest college on campus? Who would have thought? I didn't know it, but Middlebury saw something in me. So quick shout out.
Yeah. I actually think that's a really good place to leave it. Really hot note like that. I feel good about that. Unless anybody has anything else to say or any questions.
Carrie, I've got a question for you. You mentioned the students with missing skills in SEL. Did you have to first start with your faculty and staff with any missing skills to get them on board?
Yes, and I would say that that's a work in progress. I probably could be doing this for the next 20 years. And not only are there skill sets missing within our adults, but there's a level of acceptance, diversification in how accepting they are of this particular system just in general. Surely we have people who want to stay true to the consequential component of how we reverse student behavior. And I just consistently bring them back to the data and say, is this really making a difference? Because that has not really changed anything that we're seeing in our data. So it surely is something that we needed to start from scratch. I actually brought an external consultant into our district who we have worked with for 7 years, just because when you're in your district, you know nothing. Like, I'm the assistant superintendent, I'm fairly well educated, but God forbid I know anything about anything in my own district. So I reached out to a third party, and that's been really, really important. Also, what's important is that administration sit right next to their teachers, roll their sleeves up with their teachers and say, how are we going to make this system better? If you do it from a top down, it is going to fail.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah.
In our school district, we, you were talking about retraining, which works really well at the elementary level, but when you get to the middle high school level and you have the consequence of either staying in detention or going to the ISS room or going to the teacher's room, how do you deal with the students who just get up and leave and don't go to those places after school and don't ever go to those places? What can you do to get those kids into a retraining situation?
Did you hear that, Gary?
Oh.
Sorry, can you, just the last part of that local?
Yeah, how do you get the students that just refuse to go to the go to the ISS or the detention after school, they just get up and leave, and I get told don't bother writing them up because they're not gonna go to where they're supposed to, where they're gonna leave, like, how do you handle that? What kind of retraining do you do for the older students?
If I'm correct, I think I heard her say that, how do you handle students who just get up and leave out of class? That
Well, at the end of the day, when it's time to leave, they just don't go to the consequence of what they've been given.
So ultimately, the majority of, I guess my response to that would be, students initially were not responding with a consequence. So dependent upon the infraction, we use our correction procedure, and our correction procedure is really trying to send some nonverbal cues to students about, and reminding them about what the expectation is in the classroom, and trying to do that based on relationships that have been built with the adults who are in their world. And we work, and we continue to work really hard at understanding that the behavior sometimes that we see, we can't personalize. It's not necessarily about us, but that we do need to build relationships with kids so that we can reach them when they are in distress, and we do need to redirect. And so our correction procedure starts with a nonverbal cueing system, and then moves to really an overall reminding of what the matrix is, a checking for understanding of every student. So we're trying not to point kids out. And then we do something in all of our classrooms called Take Two. Some people call it Zen Zone, some people call it Chill Zones, but it's kind of an opportunity for a teacher to quietly go over and say, you know what, I think you just need to reset yourself. Take 2 minutes, and then I want you to join back in instruction. And really what that is we don't want kids placing themselves outside of instruction, and we don't want teachers kicking kids out of instruction. Instruction is, there's so little of it in a day that we really need to have as much on as we can. And the final component of our correction procedure is that reteach. And oftentimes the people who are in our reteaching areas are those individuals who have already built strong, they just have it in them. They've built strong relationships with kids. They're naturals at it. I would say that they probably are better at that than any other thing that they do, including their content area. And so those individuals end up intercepting those students, and we do the whole instructional methodology of I do, we do, you do, and we practice that skill set until students are able to get it right. Now, in that practice is a lot of conversation, and oftentimes it's therapeutic just for the student to get it off their chest. And then we return them back to classroom as soon as we see that they have that, they've been able to practice and execute that skill set. Sometimes it takes an hour because and the kid doesn't return because there's something not right in that kid's world, and we need to address that and assist with that. So that is our first go-to. And that is what we spend a lot of time trying to do to shape and redirect student behavior before we move to discipline and consequence. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
But I've been admonished for going over like 3 times on this. So we're gonna leave it there. We have another group coming in. Thank you, Dave, Carol, they're each bringing some rich perspective, and we really appreciate everything you brought, and we'd love to thank you for coming.
Hi, everybody. Carol and Carrie, nice to work with you.
Thanks,
you all.
everybody.
I'll be
Thank you for
connected
the
with you both.
opportunity. Nice to meet everybody. Take care.
Good to meet you all. Thank you.